All right, welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you had a fruitful ginger conversation in your room. Apologies for those of you who ended up in a room by yourself with 90 people. It doesn't seem to work as seamlessly as with fewer people. So let's move on to sort of closing off the ginger insight. And I'm going to start sharing my screen again. So one of the things that ginger causes is communication difficulties in the moment, as perhaps you have discussed in your examples. But there are sort of wider effects, or ginger is often a symptom of other things that are going on within a sector. And when we're looking at a conservative risk estimate, that's a term that people interpret differently in different communities. But what it actually covers is different practices that sit underneath it. And I put it down here on the climate science side, that the focus of error avoidance, that science often is knowledgeable of errors and trying to avoid certain errors. But that within the climate science community, the focus is on avoiding false positives. Whereas in some other risk domains, the focus actually is on avoiding the false negatives, on making sure that nothing slips through the nets. And that practice difference makes the term then have that different language, that different meaning. But of course, the practice differences themselves are very crucial to how you're positioning climate risk in relation to other kinds of risks. And there's one example that when I was thinking about is like, what's a good example of a risk community trying to avoid the false negatives? I thought of the bridge in London, Hammersmith Bridge, which was recently closed because they had discovered some cracks in the bridge. And at first it was closed for traffic only, but then it was also closed for pedestrians and cyclists. And the reasoning behind it was that the worst case that could happen with that bridge, that it would collapse. And the worst case would even be that it collapsed at the moment that a school of 6-year-old children is crossing the bridge. So someone had asked that question, done that reasoning, and said, no matter how much or how little uncertainty there is about that specific problem, the worst case is too bad here, and we need to do something. We need to take a drastic step here. So that's one example of avoiding false negatives that led to a very clear decision outcome that you don't usually have available in climate because there is an overemphasis on avoiding the false positives. Now, what about communicating uncertainty? This other example that we were talking about, and the concept of communicating uncertainty came back throughout the first 2 days, and also will come back later this afternoon. So there are two options here. The first one is to try and bridge that gap, to really try to get across that you're not just talking about not knowing, about being in doubt, but that there is knowledge in the fact that there is a range of outcomes possible. And there are certainly specific decision contexts where that will be very important. And we will see some examples of that later in the session today. But the other option could be, and we're not doing that very well at the moment, or not at all almost, is to work with the end users of your research to collapse the uncertainty to certain values that are important for decision making. So rather than focusing on trying to find better ways to communicate the uncertainty, you could try to work together with the decision maker to figure out what are the values of real importance to decision making, and those are the values that you could communicate out. That is something that we need to figure out how to do better. We don't do it well at the moment. And it has the advantage that we would be supporting decision-making much more better than if we just focus on finding better ways of communicating the uncertainty. If we keep on doing that, what will happen is that the people that we work most closely with, the ones that are in the value chain that Mark showed earlier, most closely related to our work, they will become accustomed to our definitions. They will make it part of their elephants, our definitions of uncertainty, but then they have a communication problem of their own, because the people that they need to communicate downstream to will be the ones that then need to be dealing with the difference in definitions that we have across those terms. So the take-home messages here is that what we think we are saying is often not what people are hearing. You can't define a way ginger really, because it sits in our elephant. It's very much part of ourselves and who we are. But what we can do is surface ginger problems early on and then find language that allows you to communicate around it. So rather than continuing to use that term, conservative risk estimate, you can be explicit in describing what it is that you mean when you're giving a risk estimate. And then the third one is adapt your practices to your target audience, which may be, for instance, that giving up on the need to communicate uncertainty and rather trying to find out what values really matter to them. So the third insight, which I'm going to touch only very briefly, is the pyramid of polarization. And what this captures is the idea of how our brains go from having only very weak opinions about something to having very strong opinions about something. What happens is that if we don't have a strong idea or a strong mindset about something in particular, like climate change or climate risk, or how we will make a certain decision in life, it's like being at the top of a pyramid. Once your mind goes like, I've been thinking about this problem for a while, I think I need to go with this decision. It's like taking a step off on one side of the pyramid. And what happens in our brains is that we start self-justifying. We start persuading ourselves that we're making the right decision. That makes our next action in the same direction much more likely. You now start to talk to friends and family about this, so you start to communicate professionally about this. And the more you take these actions down the sides of the pyramid, the more you convince yourself that you're making the right decision. What happens is that someone who almost accidentally or serendipitously stepped off on the other side of the pyramid goes down their side of the pyramid and becomes very convinced, very certain that they are making the right decision as well. So it helps us to understand how polarization emerges in a domain of climate change. Now, until a few years ago, this would have been most appropriate to describe the distinction between the climate skeptics and the climate believers, for lack of a better word. But in the last few years, something else is happening. As the societal concern about climate change is increasing, more and more people are stepping off sides of the pyramid with respect to what we need to do about climate change. And that leads to a fragmentation of what people see as meaningful action on climate change. So there's all of these fault lines that are appearing in society about what we should do to tackle climate change. And here are just a few of them. There's one in particular that's important for communication about climate change, which is that perennial debate that you can run into on Twitter of whether we should use fear messaging or hope messaging around climate change. Our answer is you shouldn't use neither. You should tell stories of action to bypass that particular distinction. But there is at the moment very strong fragmentation and polarization across different groups of people who think that we should be focusing on fear versus hope. Now, why is this important for climate risk communication? Because the higher the perceived risk of climate change, the more that fragmentation can keep on happening. And that means that risk information in itself is not going to be enough to lead to clear policy and action. We will need to do other things in addition to communicate the risk. And that's about how you communicate with your end users to help you to understand how to turn risk information into action information. We're going to have a session on that in a little bit. The second point is that if you find yourself in one of those heated debates, if you are part of that yourself, or you see some other people battling it out with each other, then take a step back from that, take a step away from that pyramid, and understand that there is a need for plurality and for this idea of alignment, this idea that we will need multiple pathways to that allow us parallel solutions to climate change to being pursued altogether. Okay, so that's it on the insights. I'm going to hand over to Freya to take us forward.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. It was really great to hear about those 3 insights there. And I know that you've actually written about more insights than just this. And so just to let all the participants know that there'll be loads more information and another couple of resources for you to go to when we get to section 5A today, and that's when we'll show you what's in the goodie bag. Now at this point, we're running a little bit behind, so we're going to give you a 10-minute break and we're going to restart at 13:40. So that's 20 minutes to the hour wherever you are. So if you could be back promptly for then, we will start the next session. And thank you, Chris.